Now is the time.
Do it now.
Okay. It starts with you saying, do it now, just so you know.
Heck yeah.
Perfect.
Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, former ranch hand, surveyor, railroad worker, lumberjack, rodeo cowboy, stuntman, and radio disc jockey.
Wow, you sound like you could be a character in a Rod McKuen song, or Rod McKuen.
Interesting. Never heard of him. Tell me more.
I remember you having many more jobs than that.
Well, that's just a selection. My greatest hits, if you will.
Beautiful. I'm co-host Jeremy, and I gotta tell you guys, I think I got swindled.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Yeah. You guys know those things where you can have a star named after you?
Yeah, those things.
Yeah, I bought one, and then I came to find out it was actually a species of starfish that was named after me. So,
And you're not into that?
not as much. I'm a little disappointed.
I'm sorry to hear that, Jeremy.
It's okay.
It's unfortunate. But I mean, also, starfish are cool.
That's true. Patrick was a starfish.
Well, I am co-host Peter Cook, and ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present Muhammad Ali. But seeing as how that's not possible, instead, I will introduce our guest, who is a Philadelphia-born musician who composed the theme song for the hit sitcom Third Rock from the Sun and was the music director for That 70s Show. He's produced albums by artists such as Alex Chilton, Alan Vega, Arthur Alexander, and Ween. And he's also released around 20 albums of his own music. He also hosts the weekly syndicated radio program, The Many Moods of Ben Vaughn. Welcome, Ben Vaughn.
Hello, hello. It's great to be here.
So excited to have you here, Ben. I think that you are the person qualified to talk about the artist that we're here to talk about today.
I am a huge fan of this artist whose name you have not revealed yet.
Yeah.
Reveal it.
The artist is Rod McKuen.
Yes, let's hear. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I applaud every time I hear his name. I get so excited.
And the album that you've chosen is called Greatest Hits of Rod McKuen, which was released on Warner Brothers in 1969. Now, people might be thinking, hey, I didn't think that we were allowed to talk about compilations and greatest hits. Well, that's pretty often the case here. We've maybe made one or two exceptions for comps, but we've never talked a greatest hits. We talked Phil Oakes' greatest hits, but that's not at all a greatest hits collection. Mm-hmm. It's just Phil Oakes being clever. Well, this is kind of unique as far as greatest hits collections go. They didn't exactly just compile his greatest hits. Rod, instead of lazily lifting songs from previous albums to create a best of, Rod chose to re-record his most popular songs with new arrangements by Arthur Greenslade. And this unconventional move paid off as this release sold over 1 million copies. I think arguably this does not break our no comps rule in that sense that it's they've all been recorded specifically for this project, and inarguably this is the most readily available comprehensive overview of Rod McKuen. Would you agree with that, Ben?
I would. His catalog is so vast and so amazing, and this is probably the best way in, I think. When you asked about an album, this is the only one I could think of, even though it's called Greatest Hits. As you said, it's all brand new recordings, so it's a pretty new record, I guess, in 1969.
Yeah, and it doesn't really sound like 1969, but it's Rod McKuen was kind of always doing his own thing.
Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. His audience, which we can talk about, his audience, who was his audience in the 60s? Because he was huge in the 60s. His books and his records sold like crazy. And he was on TV all the time. I first discovered him, he was on the Johnny Cash show, which would have been 1969 probably. And he came on and he did Doesn't Anyone Know My Name? And Johnny Cash was real excited to have Rod there. And he said, I knew Rod McKuen was going to be on, and he was going to read a poem about trains. So I decided to write a poem about trains myself. And then they both recite poems about trains and do a duet on Doesn't Anybody Know My Name? And I was blown away. That was my first exposure to Rod. So he had Johnny Cash's stamp of approval, so I didn't look any further. I didn't realize later that people made fun of Rod McKuen because Johnny Cash approved him in the beginning. So, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, sure. I think a lot of people would agree that you get that Cash stamp of approval. You're good to go. And yeah, we'll talk a whole lot more about Rod McKuen and how he's perceived. But let's go ahead and listen to that song you were talking about, Doesn't Anybody Know My Name?
It's a really great song. He wrote it in his folk music days, which would have been the early 60s. He released a version of this as a folk record. It sounded kind of like the Kingston Trio, I guess. And then he re-recorded it for this record with some orchestration. So it's less rough and less rustic, but it's a really great song because the chorus, he keeps asking, what time do the trains roll in? 2:10, 6:18, or 10:44? And you're wondering, why is he asking? Why doesn't he just look at the schedule, And then by the third verse, he there's a little hint. He says, I don't have to read a sign to know things ain't the same. And then in the last verse, it's revealed that he's a soldier who came back from war and he's now blind. Mm-hmm. And nobody wants him anymore because he's a wounded veteran. It's a heavy song. It's a very, very heavy song and impossible to make fun of, really. A lot of people like to make fun of Rod McKuen, but I dare them to go after this one. I dare them.
Well, with all that in mind, yeah, let's listen to that song, Doesn't Anybody Know My Name? Side B, track 6.
I've been away so long, fought a war that's come and gone. Doesn't anybody know my name? My sister's up and wed, my mama's took to bed. Now my old dog Red's gone lame. Please tell me if you can, what time do the trains roll in? 2:10, 6:18, 10:44. The hedges turning brown, the house is falling down. Doesn't anybody know my name? The girl I left behind, she's run off to Caroline. I don't have to read a sign to know things ain't the same. Please tell me if you can, what time do the trains roll in? 2:10, 6:18, 10:44. You can't go far away on just a soldier's pay. Doesn't anybody know my name?
Well, I'll just come right out of the gate and admit that I had never heard of Rod McKuen before this week.
I guarantee you've flipped past him in the bins many times, though.
I probably have, and it's like one of those names that I probably didn't even register. Like, you don't know what it is, and you just go right past it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, report back in a few weeks. I think you're going to start seeing this name pop up everywhere when you're out and about.
Yep. My initial impression as a total Rod newbie was kind of immediately seeing parallels with one of my all-time favorites, Leonard Cohen.
Yeah.
And this was before I even read anything about him, just listening to the album, and was 0% surprised to find out he was a poet who was then writing songs. So it has that same feel of Leonard Cohen, of like poetry put to song, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a apt comparison.
Yeah, that is an apt comparison. Rod was better known as a poet, sold millions and millions and millions of books. He was at one point the best-selling living poet in the world. And, well, poets don't usually sell that many books, so the fact that he sold so many alone is crazy. But he's overlooked as a songwriter, which is why I wanted to talk to you guys about his music, because he was a great songwriter. His singing is odd, because he's down to a whisper at this point in his life, because according to him, he blew his voice out playing at the Copacabana in 1963, because they had a lounge next to the regular Copacabana where the teenagers would go and do the twist and everything, and he was in some kind of twist band screaming his head off and lost his voice. And from that point on, he whispered pretty much everything. And that vocal on that song we just heard is a great example. By the third verse, he's starting to sound a little strange.
Yeah, he's sounding very weathered in just the duration of one song.
But that really worked for him because it drew people in closer. You know, when he whispered or was down to a whisper, people would lean in more to hear what he had to say. So it was an effective thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that kind of like damaged vocal sound, I feel like, just adds to the vibe of the songs, and just kind of like it almost sells it more. It's like I'm like listening harder, just like to see what he's talking about.
Right? Yeah.
This song in particular, like, fits the character of the song. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's such a good song too. I mean, just the way it's written, it's pretty much flawless. I really love this song.
Another guy that he reminded me of is Tom Waits, especially in the earlier years when he was doing more of a traditional singer-songwriter kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely.
And he's one of those songwriters that other musicians love to perform his songs, or at least did in his heyday. Like, that one was recorded by the Kingston Trio, Waylon Jennings, and Hank Williams Jr. As you mentioned, Rod McKuen performed that with Johnny Cash on the Johnny Cash Show. So many of the songs that he penned were out there in the world. People may have not even known that they were songs he had written. Yeah, he was just sort of kind of a ubiquitous figure in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, he really was. I remember it, and I'm old enough to remember his impact and seeing him on Ed Sullivan and, various things, sitting on a stool, singing his own translation of a Jacques Brel tune. He was everywhere in the late 60s, by 66 through like the early 70s. Almost impossible to avoid. And he released so many records on so many different labels. And you guys know, as thrift store shoppers, there's always another one you've never seen. Mm-hmm. Or another book that he wrote that you didn't know. And he even put out calendars every year, which are really great, with his thoughts on it every month. He had a huge fan base. And that fan base were the people who weren't comfortable with Jimi Hendrix, burning his guitar, or all the acid rock. It's kind of the way people look at the history of the '60s is kind of it favors the crazy part of the '60s, and you could believe that everyone went nuts in the '60s. But there were people who went to work every day, and they went to college, and they got their degrees and did their things.
And bought Rod McKuen records.
Yeah, they were also searching, but not in a as rebellious or as loud way, and Rod was their voice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like that's come up a few times before where, yeah, people think of a certain time in music as one style, but there's a whole range of audience out there buying different things. You know, like when we did our Mystic Moods Orchestra record, I feel like there's similar fan bases were probably buying those that were buying the Rod McKuen albums around that time who were not into this loud new music that was happening. Also, it's a little bit wild to think that you could have gone into the store and bought this brand new right alongside the first Stooges album.
Right. There you go. There you go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In Ann Arbor, Michigan, the MC5 and the Three Stooges are going nuts. And meanwhile, Rod's
out there doing his thing.
Yeah, takes all sorts. And I feel like there's a lot of artists who the counterculture generation at the time deemed to be uncool, and that uncool label just kind of stuck forever, and not enough people ever went back and was like, well, so many of these artists were huge right before this cultural shift and had a lot of talent. Maybe just because they weren't making wild and crazy psychedelic music, it doesn't mean they weren't making music worth digging back into.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell you where I first heard of Rod McKuen. It was about 12 years ago when I saw that there was a solo album out by Aaron Freeman, better known as Gene Ween, from the legendary duo Ween out of New Hope, Pennsylvania. This was his first solo album, and he was releasing it under his own name. And then I see that it's a tribute to Rod McKuen. It's all Rod McKuen songs. It's called Marvelous Clouds. And lo and behold, it turns out you produced that album, Ben.
I did. Aaron and I were both Rod McKuen fans, and we finally, there was a lull in the Ween career because they weren't performing. We decided to go in the studio, and then we took the final product to Rod and played it for him.
Wow.
And he loved it. I was friends with Rod. I sought him out. He was living in Beverly Hills in his mansion, very much a Sunset Boulevard scenario. It was just him in his old mansion that he bought in the early 70s. It had a recording studio in the basement. He was there alone with his partner, Edward, and the swimming pool was empty, and it was really like an interesting scenario. I was hired to interview him for a documentary about Johnny Mercer, because I don't know if I'm sure your audience knows who he is, but
yeah, he wrote the lyrics to Moon River.
Yeah, and he wrote like a million, One for My Baby, One for the Road. The list goes on and on of how many great songs, and Rod was friends with him. And they hired me to go in and interview Rod. And after we did about a half hour of Johnny Mercer questions, I started pulling out questions about Rod's own career, and he really enjoyed it and invited me back. And I went back and hung out at Rod's house. And when we did the Marvelous Clouds album, I took Aaron over, and Aaron was really nervous because he's going to meet Rod McKuen,
Yeah.
he was like a little kid, like, oh, no. And I'm like, no, calm down. He's a nice man. And he really was an incredibly nice guy. And he did speak like, hello, Ben, it's great to see you. It was, you had to lean in to hear him.
That's incredible. Now, you had previously worked with Ween on their 12 Golden Country Greats album, where their album was recorded by Nashville session musicians.
Yeah, that was, they came to me. I've known those guys since they were teenagers. The first time I met Ween, Mickey, who is Dean Ween, he was probably 15 or 16, and he handed me a cassette and said, I really want you to hear my band. And it was a recording of him and Aaron inhaling helium and laughing. So I said with a very serious face, I don't hear a hit. And I said, get back to me when you have some songs. And then they gave me, they kind of kept me updated. And so I've known them since they were teenagers.
Well, that's what, they're by reputation for people who aren't Ween fans. They might think that it's odd for Aaron to put out a record of Rod McKuen songs, but you could always tell from those early Ween albums that he had a penchant for 60s, 70s singer-songwriters and ballads. There were always a few of those scattered throughout their very bizarre discography.
Yeah, he loves soft rock. He loves it. Shannon by Henry Gross is like his favorite record of all time, which is a weepy, I don't know if you've ever heard it, but it's it's an ode to a dog that died. It makes you cry when you hear it. And that's Aaron's favorite song. So I always wanted to collaborate with him on the soft rock side of things. And then we just all of a sudden decided we needed to go in the studio and pay tribute to Rod McKuen, because Rod's songbook is overlooked. No one has ever collected it properly and celebrated it, and we wanted to pay tribute to it because he's not known enough as a great songwriter. And these are like standards. They sound like standards to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for helping introduce Rod McKuen to me, and it's phenomenal that we now get to have you on the podcast talking about him. Should we get to another song before we go any further?
Let's get to another song.
So next up, we were going to play the song Lonesome Cities.
Love this song.
It was first recorded by Frank Sinatra for his 1969 album, A Man Alone, the words and music of Rod McKuen. So there's someone else people might have heard of who's paid tribute to Rod McKuen.
Yeah, Frank believed that Rod's songs were standards too. It's just younger people, the rock crowd, never caught on,
Until now.
Until now, yes.
Well, let's listen to Lonesome Cities, Side B, Track 3.
There's a few more lonesome cities that I'd like to see, while a wine of wandering is still inside of me. There's a few more pretty women that I'd like to know, a bridge or two I'd like to cross, a few more roads to sow. Maybe when I've done it all, seen all there is to see, I'll find out I still cannot run away from me. But as long as trains keep a-running, a restless man I'll be. And there's a few more lonesome cities I'd like to see. Maybe when I've done it all, seen all there is to see.
Yeah, listening to that, I can hear, like that should be a standard, and it's such a Frank Sinatra sounding song.
Yeah, that was my favorite one. Had that torch singer vibe that I total sucker for.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a great song, about a guy who, when the train whistle blows, he's got to go, But what I really like about it is the bridge when he says, maybe when I've done it all, seen all there is to see, I'll find out I still cannot run away from me. So he's admitting that he's running away from knowing himself by moving all the time. It's a great song.
Yeah, hearing Aaron perform that song, knowing the struggles that he was going through with achieving sobriety at around that time that that you recorded that Marvelous Clouds record, I really felt like he was singing it from his heart.
Yeah, he did it. He was really in a vulnerable place when we made this. And a guitar solo on the Lonesome Cities on that album is Aaron playing it, the gut string guitar.
Yeah, I know he. Mickey Dean Ween is known as the shredder of Ween, but Aaron, he can really play expressively when he does.
Oh, he's a great musician. He also is a great bass player. He will deny that if you ask him, but he's an incredible bass player. I like everything he plays on bass, which is an odd talent for him to have, but he's very solid on bass.
Yeah, as someone that spent a lot of my time thinking about Ween the past 25 years, I've never known that detail.
Yeah.
He's an excellent bassist. That's very cool. Well, would we like to get into a little bio on Rod McKuen here?
I don't know. My eyes are dry right now. Kind of want to keep them that way. Maybe we shouldn't get into it.
I hear you. I hear you. So Rod McKuen was born Rodney Martin Wooliver on April 29th, 1933 in Oakland, California. He was born to a single mother. He ran away from home at age 11 to escape an abusive stepfather. He worked a series of odd jobs while drifting up and down the West Coast. This list looks familiar. Sean, this guy had a similar life to you. He was a ranch hand, lumberjack, railroad worker, rodeo cowboy, stuntman, and radio DJ. He would send money back home to his mother from time to time.
Yeah, I don't do that, though. That's the difference between us.
Okay.
I'm keeping all the money for myself.
Yeah, the hell with mom.
Yeah.
As a way of compensating for his lack of formal education, he kept a journal and developed a fondness for writing and poetry. Rod adopted the surname McKuen in reference to what he believed to be his biological father's name, although he was unsure of the spelling as he had never met his father. A private investigator he later hired determined that Rod was close with both the spelling, I guess the E and the N were reversed, and geographically he was close as well, with the man determined to be Rod's biological father living only about 20 miles away from Rod, although that man had already passed away by the time this was brought to Rod's attention. Dropping out of high school, Rod found work as a newspaper columnist. Later, serving in the Korean War, Rod worked as a propaganda screenwriter. After the war, he settled in San Francisco and got in the mix with beat icons like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and he would read poetry in clubs alongside them. He started performing as a folk singer at the Purple Onion, the venue where people like Bob Newhart, Richard Pryor, Maya Angelou, and the Smothers Brothers got their starts. And eventually he began releasing albums on a variety of labels and releasing them prolifically, which he would basically do for his remaining days. He also sang with Lionel Hampton's band and briefly moved to New York at the end of the 1950s to compose and conduct music for the 1960 season of CBS Television Workshop. But he then spent the early 1960s in France, where he began to translate the work of Belgian singer Jacques Brel into English. The international pop standard If You Go Away resulted from this, as would the song Seasons in the Sun, most famously recorded by Terry Jacks in 1974. Both of those songs are included on this collection.
The song Seasons in the Sun was a sort of pivotal song in my early childhood.
Really?
My dad really liked the Terry Jacks version of it. And I remember hearing it as like a pretty young child and just recognizing that, oh, this is very different, because my parents listened to classic rock, and for the most part, lyrically, it doesn't have that kind of depth.
Yeah.
A little deeper than the Urban Cowboy soundtrack.
A little bit.
Although it is a song, it is a song about a man dying.
Yeah.
But anyway, I digress.
Yeah, it's a heavy song.
It's a very heavy song, yeah.
So Rod McKuen began publishing books of his poetry in the late 1960s, and was, as we said, he was unusually popular for a poet. His books have been translated into 11 languages and have sold a total of over 60 million copies. I mean, that's huge for poetry. But despite its popularity, or perhaps in spite of its popularity, his poetry was never well received by critics or academics. The words kitsch and schmaltz are never in short order in a review of his poetry or music, and can even have both positive and negative connotations when they're used. McKuen himself would quip, "The most unforgivable sin in the world is to be a best-selling poet."
Yeah.
That rings true. But regardless, he was prolific, not only as a poet, but as a songwriter. He penned over 1,500 songs and released somewhere between 100 and 200 albums. I tried to count. It's sort of impossible. Worldwide sales total over 100 million. So as we said, that's why every time you think you've seen every Rod McKuen album there is to see, there's another one. And kind of the same with the books of poetry. And his songs have been recorded by people like Johnny Mathis, Dusty Springfield, as we mentioned, Frank Sinatra, Johnny Cash, Perry Como, Al Hirt, Barbra Streisand, Waylon Jennings, the Kingston Trio, Chet Baker, Robert Goulet, and Petula Clark. That's just the very top of the list. You may notice his songs often don't contain gender references. Although he never identified publicly as any orientation, he made comments about not being able to imagine picking one gender over another, and was active in LGBT rights movements as early as the 1950s. He would refer to his longtime live-in partner, Edward Habib, as his brother or half-brother, often publicly. He also, it doesn't stop with this guy. He also worked as a film composer. He collaborated with Arthur Greenslade, who did the arrangements on this record. They collaborated on films like Joanna, Scandalous John, and The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, the last of which also featured the big hit song Jean, written by Rod McKuen. And that one was also featured on Aaron Freeman's Marvelous Clouds. He also later would score larger scale classical pieces for orchestras. He dabbled in acting and voice acting. I guess he was a voice in The Little Mermaid. For many years, he continued to perform sellout concerts around the world and appeared regularly at Carnegie Hall. He would retire from live performing in 1981 due to struggles with clinical depression, and he passed away January 29th, 2015, from clinical heart failure in Beverly Hills at the age of 81. So yeah, he lived a very full life, and that's just sort of the quick capsule review of it.
And he was like a true Western man. His childhood and everything, everything happened. He was a Western guy. No one really knows how much of that early childhood and teenage years stuff is true. Rod was a fabulist. And he kind of retold his story a lot, and some of the facts changed. But definitely had a rough childhood, that's for sure.
Yeah, when I saw the whole list of occupations, that was one of the first clues that I had to really wonder if he was kind of putting on the creative writer hat pretty early on there. But it makes for a great story. He was able to make people feel things, and things that could be universally related to. He was good at setting that up.
Yeah, he was really also really good at putting what you felt into words. Like most great poets do, you read a poem and you go, wow, that's what I was trying to say.
Well, lyrically, one of my favorite pieces is The Marvelous Clouds.
Do you want to play it?
I would like to play that next.
I had a suspicion.
And of course, this is Aaron Freeman of Ween. Used this as the title for his tribute to Rod McKuen. So let's listen to The Marvelous Clouds, Side B, Track 1.
I'm the son of the wild swan of Flanders, who sailed on a river of dreams. My mother, the swan, has left me and gone. My home is the banks of the stream. And the marvelous clouds sail by, marvelous clouds. Aloft in the soft summer sky, marvelous clouds. I've seen all the lovers in doorways, I've heard every promise at dawn. I've spent too much time just standing in line to be told I should move along. And the marvelous clouds sail by, marvelous clouds, aloft in the soft summer sky, marvelous clouds. I've looked in the eyes of your heroes as they sail home from far distant lands. The mud on their uniforms, mud on their boots, blood on their faces and hands. And the marvelous clouds sail by, marvelous clouds, aloft in the soft summer sky, marvelous clouds. My father, the king of the mountain, looks down and watches his child. Come home, says he, if you hate what you see, you're young and the country is wild. But I stay and I wait for the cannons and the drums to stop drumming my ear. Is it too late, mankind? Have you run out of time? It's a matter of days or just years. And the marvelous clouds sail by, marvelous clouds.
One thing I was thinking about, because as Ben mentioned, Rod has not carried into us younger generations. You know, it gets called schmaltzy and all that. But I think looking at his life, it registers to me more as like escapism. You know, he's seen enough bad, dark stuff that he doesn't want to dwell in that space all the time. Yeah, so that was a thought I had.
I think there's quite a bit of that. Yeah, this song is really interesting to me because it's kind of an anti-war song. The last two verses are, but do the clouds care? You know, no matter what's going on in the world, what village is being blown up, a beautiful day is a beautiful day. You know, birds, the clouds in the sky, the sun comes out and all that. It kind of just repeats this apathy towards what mankind is doing. You know, nature kind of repeats this apathy. But in this one here, though, the second verse sounds like it's about gay rights to me. I've seen all the lovers in doorways. I've heard every promise at dawn. I've spent too much time just standing in line to be told I should move along. It's he's always got some stuff in there. You know, it's easy to be tempted to have his music go in one ear and out the other, but there's always a line or two in there that it suggests something else going on. He's kind of the master at that. I really like that about his writing.
I really liked his delivery on that song. We talked about a lot of these tracks being at a whisper, and that one is kind of letting loose. It's like slightly more high energy, but I don't know. There's something about the way he delivers these kind of songs that it's still very much, it has elements of spoken word to it in like the way that he's phrasing things, but it just gives it this unique quality to the way he's singing it that I find really engaging.
Yeah, he kind of rushes the beat, I noticed, on a few of the, kind of gets like ahead.
He runs out of breath at the end of the third verse, or blood on their faces and hands, a marvelous cloud. He's like, it's a brisk tempo, you know, and it's got doom dum ba dum boom doom doom dum, you know, the kind of take five thing going on behind him, and it's probably a little faster than it ought to be. As a record producer, I would make that comment: Arthur, slow it down. Arthur Greenslade, fantastic composer, arranger, but you know, he counted it off a little too fast, I think.
Yeah, it definitely feels like he's rushing right along with those marvelous clouds. I should mention, I'd be remiss if I did not mention that yesterday I was talking to my mother, and I mentioned that we were going to be recording an episode on Rod McKuen, and she was telling me that when her and my father first met in 1969, one of the first things they connected on was their dislike of Rod McKuen. Apparently a car drove by playing Rod McKuen, and they both just were like, oh, I can't stand him. You know, it was the late 60s, and they were, you know, at least, if not hippies, definitely of the a radical mindset that I'm sure Rod McKuen did not represent for people. So I thought that was pretty funny. It's like, well, that's how I rebel against my parents, is getting into Rod McKuen.
Yeah. Finally.
Yeah, that's how you should do rebel. Get into Rod McKuen. There is a lot that you can find if you just give his lyrics some time. I mean, he has so many songs that some of them probably aren't going to register for you, but they're like that one right there. I think is just an incredible song. The imagery.
Well, the reason we did that record with Aaron was I wanted to take Rod as the artist out of it and just, show the writing for how good it is, sung in a very natural, pleasing style by Aaron, and let the songs stand on their own. Because Rod was so famous when your mom and dad had that moment that it's sort of like, Taylor Swift or something. You're like, you don't even, maybe you never even listen to them, but you just know you hate them. Because they're popular, they're famous.
Yeah, so many people like them. They must be bad.
Right. It's like a John Grisham novel, How good can it be if everybody loves it, And they're well written. Those books are well written. There's a reason why they're popular, and the reason why Rod, he connected with a lot of people with his poetry and his songwriting, but he was omnipresent at the time. And there was a sentimentality to him, an interesting combination, actually, of sentimentality and an aloofness. You never knew what you were going to get with Rod. He would pull you in and make you feel like he's telling you something personal, and then all of a sudden it goes cold, and he's aloof, and he's got to leave town, He's got to leave town. A lot of his songs are about giving himself completely to a person, a romantic partner, and then he hears that train whistle, and he's got to go. And he kind of did that, with his whole career. There was a approach, avoid kind of thing going on.
Classic rambler.
Yeah. And the funny thing about Rod is he had a reputation as a loner. So there are all these photographs of him alone, except there was a photographer there, so he really wasn't alone.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I think in some cases that photographer may have been Edward, his partner.
That's quite possible, yeah. I knew Edward. Interesting guy, very protective of Rod. He didn't want me to get close to Rod in the beginning, but he loosened up.
Oh, interesting. Well, that's really great that you had the opportunity to get to know Rod after being a lifelong fan.
It really was great, and it was great that he was such a nice guy and really a really gentle, really nice guy.
Yeah, it's good to hear after. I can imagine it'd be easy to become very bitter when you become like a cultural joke or whatever. If you were the biggest thing in the world and then all of a sudden everybody thinks you're awful because you were the biggest thing in the world.
Yeah, I would imagine having a mansion in Beverly Hills helped.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the money was still coming in. So.
It was, yeah. He was very wealthy.
Well, Sean, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm listening. You have my attention.
Did you happen to put together a list of recommended similar greatest hits compilations to this one?
Kind of. I did put at least one compilation on my list.
Well, that is acceptable.
All right. Well, let's start off with that compilation recommendation. I'm recommending the album How Are Things in Your Town from 1971 by Ken Nordine.
Ooh, yes.
Another guy who towed the line between spoken word and singing. He released a lot of interesting kind of like beat poetry, jazz style spoken word albums, a lot in the 50s and 60s, most of which are really hard to find and rather expensive. But the compilation How Are Things in Your Town compiles some of his late 50s, early 60s recordings, and that one can still be found relatively cheap. But very interesting guy, very interesting records, well worth digging into.
And the front cover features an enema bag hanging on a door.
Yeah, it's an interesting artwork.
Like on a mountaintop or something. It's very weird, very weird photograph. It's a great record. I'm with you on that one.
Nice. All right, next two recommendations are albums that we have featured on the show before. First one, Richard Harris, A Tramp Shining from 1968.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a case where you've got a brilliant songwriter behind the non-traditional singer, Jimmy Webb.
Yeah, but a non-traditional singer who knew how to make it very engaging.
He sold it.
Yeah. Last recommendation, a guy we've mentioned several times and one we featured before, Frank Sinatra and his 1970 album, Watertown.
Yeah, that was the first one I thought of. And then you mentioned the connections to Frank, and it all adds up in my mind.
There you go.
Frank was taking some chances back then.
Yeah, I was really blown away. I was unfamiliar with Watertown when we talked about it now a few years ago with guest Ryan Werner. I didn't realize that there was also such a avid fan base that have dissected that album.
Oh yeah, it's great. It's great.
I had a recommendation this week again, Sean.
Ooh, yeah, lay it on me.
I'm shoeing in on your zone lately.
That's fine.
A record I want to feature eventually, Mort Schumann's My Death, that also came out in 1969.
Whoa, okay. the other Jacques Brel translator.
Yeah. And yeah, there's some spoken word poet kind of stuff in there. Little wackier on the arrangements on that one, but I feel like it's got a similar energy in a certain way.
Well, thanks, guys. Thank you both for bringing those recommended similar albums. Ben, before we get out of here, do you want to talk a little bit more about your radio show or anything else you have going on to plug for our listeners out there?
Yeah, sure. I have a radio show. It's a syndicated radio show. It's on, I think, 28 different terrestrial radio stations, as they call them now. And it's available as a podcast. It's called The Many Moods of Ben Vaughn, and it's basically my record collection. And I usually pull 2 or 3 records out and do a little backstory. And it's been going for about 15 years now. And it's increasingly popular, which makes me very happy. It's actually, I get a lot of really great positive feedback. And also in 2025, a 40th anniversary reissue of my first record ever that I ever put out, a 45 called My First Band, is going to be reissued for a record store day with a bunch of stuff going on around that, activities. So it's great.
Nice. Very cool.
That'd have been like 1984, 85 then?
1985, I put my first 45 out.
Wow.
And I've been working ever since. And I didn't have it, it's funny because I was already, I was 30 years old when that happened. So I had a long life, working manual labor jobs before that record came out. I was a landscaper, and Marshall Crenshaw recorded one of my songs, and that the money that came in from that allowed me to quit my job as a landscaper. So thank you, Marshall Crenshaw.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. And yeah, you've had a very productive and prolific career since then.
Yeah, it's been great. It's been great. It turns out that, I thought I was onto something my whole life, as far as my take on music or my, excitement about it or whatever. And it turned out I was on a good track, and people respond to what I do. So it's really been awesome.
A friend of mine, when I mentioned that we were going to have you on the podcast, said that he saw you probably 30 or more years ago at Club Soda in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and said it was one of the best shows he ever saw there. I think you played with Mojo Nixon, that was also on the bill.
That sounds right. I remember it snowed that night, and we crashed at this guy. We couldn't afford hotel rooms, so what would happen is when we got done the gig, my road manager would drag me out into the audience to meet people, and hopefully they would offer a place to stay. And we stayed at this guy who was a Muzak DJ on the local Kalamazoo Muzak station. He had to get up in the morning and go to the station in a blizzard and play Ray Conniff records. I remember that's what I remember about Kalamazoo, Michigan in 1987.
It was that long ago. Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, I remember the weirder parts of that stuff The gig, I don't really remember, but I remember that guy. I remember that guy.
That is often how it goes. I remember many strange people I met on tour, but not the actual important details.
Exactly.
Yeah, those are the memorable parts.
Yeah.
By the way, I would like to recommend a greatest hits, but it's actually like a compilation. Kink Chronicles, the Kinks Chronicles, one of the best ever.
That's a double disc, right?
Yeah, great record, great collection.
I think they threw some lesser known stuff on there, like Mindless Child of Motherhood.
Yeah. What happened is John Mendelsohn was working for Warner Brothers at that time, and the reason it exists is because the Kinks signed with RCA, and we're moving on, and Warner Brothers was like, we need to make some more Kinks money. What can we do? And they put that collection out, and it sold a lot, and because it's really good. It's a really good collection, but a lot of obscure tunes on there.
Yeah. The Davies songbook goes deep.
Oh man,
both Ray and Dave.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Well, Ben, we could just probably talk music history all the live long day with you, and I think that means we'll have to have you back sometime. But we should probably wrap up here with Rod McKuen. You had suggested we go out on the song "The World I Used to Know."
Yeah, this is another one of those Rod songs where, like the lyrics, someday some old familiar rain will come along and know my name, and then my shelter will be gone, and I'll have to move along. And then he says, but meanwhile, I'll sleep with you. It's like, and each song is like, each verse is about him, I'm here now, I'm present, I'm really with you, with his romantic partner, but I'm not going to hang around.
Classic Rod.
Yeah.
I saw that this was recorded by Jimmy Rogers in 1964, who had a sizable adult contemporary hit with it. It was also recorded that year by the Kingston Trio, so familiar names again, recording these Rod McKuen songs.
Yeah, they're good, sturdy songs. They can hold up to any kind of arrangement anyone wants to put, inflict on them. The songs hold up. They're great.
Yeah.
I have a question before we go, Ben.
Sure.
I didn't realize that you had met Rod, but I read that he has one of the largest private record collections. Did you see it?
It was humongous. Yes. He had a whole, just amazing. He also had a recording studio in the basement where he also had a whole mess of records, and all of his reel-to-reel tapes were down there. He had it was kind of stuck in 1972. Grill cloth speakers and couches and everything. Like he didn't upgrade it. It was really amazing. His environment was awesome, and he did have millions of records.
So it was like a true time capsule and archive.
Yeah, and kind of spooky. Really was like like Sunset Boulevard. Except that I'm alive to tell about it. That's the difference.
Yeah. Well, I have no doubt that you were the person to come on and talk Rod McKuen with us, and people will see these records out there. So give Rod a shot. You're gonna see his name when you're flipping through those records next time you go out. I guarantee you'll come across.
Grab one, give it a listen. There's great stuff on every one of them.
Well, let us get out of here on The World I Used to Know, which it seems like Rod was trying to preserve that world he used to know with his decor and feng shui. Thank you for listening to I'd Buy That for $1. My name is Peter Cook.
I'm Jeremy Ruggles.
I'm Sean Hartman.
And I was Ben Vaughn.
Thank you, Ben. The World I Used to Know, Side A, Track 2.
Someday some old familiar rain will come along and know my name. Then my shelter will be gone, and I'll have to move along. Till I do, I'll stay a while, track the hidden country of your smile. Someday the man I used to be will come along and call on me. Then because I'm just a man, you'll find my feet are made of sand. Till that time, I'll tell you lies, chart the hidden boundaries of your eyes.